welcome to my talk. There are these two ways in which you might get involved in wrongdoing. One obvious way is to act wrongly, for instance, by storming into a diner, as in Pulp Fiction, armed with a gun and by robbing the cash register. Alternatively, you might participate in others' wrongdoing, for instance, by being on the lookout for the police as your friend is robbing the diner. Accordingly, there are these two ways in which you might be responsible for wrongdoing. Directly, when you are the one who has done it, or indirectly, when you have been implicated in others' wrongdoing. Responsibility for participation in others' wrongdoing, that is, complicity, is the topic of this paper. In it, I will sketch a minimalistic kind of complicity, that is, an account on which complicity does not require that the accomplice's psychology satisfies stringent conditions. More precisely, I will defend a view of complicity on which complicity in phi requires neither that you intend to participate in phi, nor that you know you are so participating. Why go for minimalistic kind of complicity? For these two sets of considerations. First, such minimalism is called for by the complex entanglements typical of human sociality. Our social lives are inextricably enmeshed in organizations that often do wrong. To give some examples, the manufacturers we work for might have lax environmental standards, and the governments of the countries where we live might wage, in our name, unjust wars. In addition to our involvement in the wrongdoing of organizations that have well-recognizable institutional structure, like private companies, states, etc., we are also deeply entwined in more diffuse systems of interactions whose functioning regularly causes unjust harm. For instance, in a city where tenants have few rights, affluent tenants moving to an up-and-coming neighborhood might encourage private developers to increase rent, which in turn might put long-term residents at risk of eviction, displacement, and homelessness. Many of us feel responsible for participating in structured organizations' wrongdoing, as well as in these more diffuse forms of collective wrongdoing, something that, following Harris, Mayer, and Yang, we might call structural injustice. Now, interestingly, even if participating in such wrongdoing formed no part of our intentions, and even if we did not know at first that we were so participating, I take it that many of us would still feel responsible for having participated in wrongdoing. In this paper, I will assume that by and large, these feelings of responsibility are onto something, and I will offer an account of complicity that does justice to them. As a result, my account won't require either intentions as to phi or knowledge about phi for someone to count as complicit in phi. There is a second reason why we need a minimalistic kind of complicity. The law of complicity recognizes the existence of what we might call negligent complicity. One example of this is found in international criminal law. As suggested by Miles Jackson, the doctrine of command responsibility, according to which commanders and superiors might be assigned liability for the crimes of their subordinates, can be interpreted as opening for military personnel the possibility of negligent complicity. For example, should soldiers under your command commit atrocities that you neither intended them to engage in nor even knew about, you could still become liable in respect of these crimes, should you have known about them. This suggests that the law calls for minimalistic kind of complicity. Indeed, because the law recognizes the possibility of negligent complicity, it therefore countenances instances of complicity where the accomplice neither intends to participate in wrongdoing nor even knows about their participation. All the more reason, then, to seek a minimalist account of complicity, something that I do in the rest of the paper. Before I do so, I would like to say a couple of words about my methodology. As my presentation suggests already, what I'm trying to do is to home in on the highest common denominator between all instances of complicity. Highest common denominator accounts of concepts or phenomenon are extremely common in philosophy. In fact, what the traditional method of conceptual analysis is designed to deliver is precisely this: the highest common denominator features that any instance of one's target concept or phenomenon displays. Now, one might wonder whether a highest common denominator approach is the right one when trying to give an account of complicity. First, you might fear that the explanatory payoff in the end might be quite small. As I made it clear already, what I think my highest common denominator approach will arrive at is a minimalist account of complicity. But you might ask, Why think that a minimalist account will say anything illuminating about complicity? Let me say a little bit more about this. As we know, the point of a philosophical elucidation of a concept or phenomenon is to identify the most illuminating features of that concept or phenomenon. Now, one challenge that philosophers often face is that many of the concepts or phenomena that we try to elucidate display disorienting lack of unity. This disunification is sometimes so acute that as a result, the most illuminating features of our target concept or phenomenon might not be found in every instantiation of that concept or phenomenon. To illustrate this, let's take a quick look at our practice of blame as theorized by Miranda Fricker. On Fricker's account, a basic feature of blame is the fact that it is typically delivered in an emotionally loaded manner. That emotional charge, indeed, is what, according to Fricker, typically enables blame to serve its point, namely to push the potentially uncaring wrongdoer into adopting the wrong party's perspective. Now, the emotional load of blame is, as it turns out, a feature that is not found in every instance of blame. Blaming someone sometimes is little more than making an emotionally neutral judgment of blameworthiness. Assume Fricker is right about all of this. It then follows that a highest common denominator approach to blame is ill-advised, because it would end up eliminating from our account at least one illuminating feature of blame, namely blame's typical emotional color. So to recap, a highest common denominator approach, when applied to a disunified concept or phenomenon, runs the risk of arriving at a not very illuminating account of that concept or phenomenon. Now, complicity, just like blame, is a disunified concept. One version of that concept is found in ordinary ethical life, as when, for instance, we wonder about how the unethical patterns of behaviors of certain companies reflect on our own decisions to buy their products. A more technical version of that concept is also found in different regions of the law, where the standards used to assess the complicity of individuals are much more precise and demanding than in ordinary ethical life, in part because the stakes of being judged complicit in a court of law are most often pretty high. You might think, therefore, that complicity's disunification does not bode well for the success of a highest common denominator approach. There is a second reason why you might fear that a highest common denominator approach is not the right one when inquiring into complicity. Complicit, I take it, is a term of ethical evaluation. When complicit in phi, you are ethically responsible for having participated with others in phi. Now, as suggested earlier, what a highest common denominator approach will home in is a minimalist account of complicity, an account on which it does not take very much to count as complicit in phi and thereby to count as ethically responsible as to phi. But you might think that this is widely implausible. Isn't judging someone to be ethically responsible supposed to be a momentous conclusion, one in particular that lays that person open to criticism, rebuke, blame, and even punishment? Let me briefly respond to these important worries in reverse order. First, it is indeed true that on my highest common denominator account of complicity, it will take relatively little to count as minimally complicit in phi, and therefore to count as ethically responsible for phi. That said, it is simply not my view that satisfying the conditions for minimal complicity means that you are therefore worthy of blame. In arguing so, I'm following several philosophers who have argued that not all instances of ethically responsible conduct are blameworthy, or praiseworthy for that matter. After all, much of our ethically significant conduct, that is, conduct for which it makes sense to regard ourselves as ethically responsible, is often conduct for which only the most austere moralism will judge us to be worthy of blame. Consider Bernard Williams' example in which a truck driver hits a child and kills them. Because Williams' truck driver did this through no negligence of his own, his conduct is obviously not blameworthy. What he did, however, is as ethically significant a piece of conduct as it gets, as suggested by the fact that we might expect that truck driver to have certain ethical reactions. For instance, feelings of regret, perhaps shame, and so on. So to recap, the blameworthiness entails ethical responsibility. The converse is simply not true. Even conduct that you have engaged in through no fault of your own might still count as ethically responsible conduct because of that context's ethical significance, and because of, relatedly, the range of ethical responses that engagement in that context renders appropriate. For instance, again, think of regret, shame, or the willingness to take on the responsibility to repair the harm done, and so on and so forth. In the context of this discussion of complicity, the point I just made is important because it highlights the possibility of blameless complicity, a possibility that surely materializes pretty often as a result of the complex entanglements of our social lives. Now, turning to the first worry, I claim that my highest common denominator approach will eventually home in on illuminating features of complicity. But the best way to show this, of course, is to proceed. Earlier, I have argued that we have good reason to offer an account of complicity on which your psychology need not satisfy demanding psychological conditions for you to count as complicit. In light of this, you might think that the most promising minimalist account of complicity is one which all it takes to be complicit in phi is to have causally contributed together with others to phi. Causation is indeed a psychologically undemanding process. There are plenty of things that we bring about, even though we neither intended them to occur, nor even knew that they would occur. Hence the attraction of causation for someone in search of a minimalist account of complicity. Let's call causalism the view that a requisite for complicity in phi is to have causally contributed to phi. A number of complicity theories are causalist, without necessarily going in for a minimalist account of complicity. So take John Gardner, for instance. On his view, an accomplice necessarily makes a causal difference to the wrongdoing they're complicit in, a difference they make via the conduct of someone else. In Gardner's own words, accomplices make their causal difference through principles. In other words, by making a difference to the difference that principles make. And difference making, of course, on Gardner's account is understood in causal terms. Causalism, however, faces several obstacles. First, cases of overdetermination put pressure on difference-making accounts such as the one that Gardner argues for. Suppose that during an election in the US, you voted for an evil candidate, and suppose that in your state, this evil candidate won by a landslide. The electors of your state will therefore vote for evil candidate during the subsequent electoral college vote. Now, it is obvious that in this case, even though you're complicit in the election of evil candidate, your vote makes no difference to what electors of your state will eventually do. Had you not voted, evil candidate will still have received the majority of your state's popular vote, and so the state's electors will still have voted in favor of evil candidate. Cases of this sort, where the accomplice overdetermines the principal's conduct, show the inadequacy of Gardner's difference-making account of complicity. Now, of course, there are more sophisticated accounts of causation than Gardner's simple difference-making conception, and on these more sophisticated accounts, it might perhaps make sense to regard your vote as a causal contribution to evil candidate's election, even if your vote made no actual difference. But even if that was the case, however, causalism would not be out of the woods. There are indeed at least two additional difficulties that causalist accounts of complicity face. First, recall that complicity is supposed to be a distinctive sort of responsibility, one that, using Gardner's language, goes through other people's conduct. Causalism, however, tends to undermine the distinctiveness of complicity's responsibility. For if complicity essentially involves a causal contribution to wrongdoing, what difference exactly does it make that others were somewhere on the causal path between your conduct and the resulting harm? On a causalist account, indeed, the very fact of your participation with others in phi does not seem to ground in any independent way your responsibility as to phi. Causation does all the normative work. It might then seem, therefore, that the notion of complicity, when explained in causalist terms, becomes an idle wheel. Here's an even bigger worry for causalist accounts. There are some paradigmatic cases of complicity where it is simply not true that the accomplice causally contributes to the wrongdoing they're complicit in. Imagine that in the diner scenario mentioned at the outset of the paper, you stand outside on the lookout for the police, ready to warn me as I'm stealing the cash register, armed with a gun. Now, let us make two additional assumptions. First, the police, as a matter of fact, never patrols in this area. And second, your being on the lookout for the police did not influence in any way my conduct. Perhaps I'm particularly reckless, and the added safety of having you on the lookout for the police is something that I simply do not see the point of. If that was so, then it seems to me that on any plausible account of causation, your being on the lookout for law enforcement plays no causal role as to the success of the robbery. That said, nobody would deny that you're my accomplice, and so someone who bears responsibility as to the robbery. It follows, therefore, that causalism is false. Contra the causalist, one's causal contribution to phi is not a prerequisite for complicity in phi. Accordingly, if causalism is false, as I've just argued, then the notion of causation does not hold the key to the minimalist account of complicity that I have aimed to articulate. We've arrived at something of a puzzle. On the one hand, there is good reason to provide an account of complicity on which complicitous responsibility does not depend on the accomplice's psychology. On the other hand, the most obvious candidate of a psychological light ground for complicity, that is causation, won't do. If causal contributions will not ground psychologically lean forms of complicity, then what will? In a nutshell, my answer is participation in a common plan of action. On my minimalist and tentative account of complicity, roughly, you're complicit in wrongdoing phi, just in case you, along with other agents, are doing your bit in a plan of action whose purpose is to phi. I will obviously not have enough time to fully develop this account, so instead, let me just say a couple of words about its intuitive appeal. First, this tentative account correctly predicts that by being on the lookout for the police, as I'm sealing the cash register, you are complicit in armed robbery, even though your actions do not causally contribute in any way to the robbery. Second, on this account of complicity, it need not be the case either that you intended to participate in phi or that you knew you were so participating for you to be doing your bit in a plan of action meant to phi, and so to count as complicit in phi. Recall the manufacturer that has lax environmental standards. There is arguably a plan of action that glues together the activities of all employees of the manufacturer, a plan that engineers have designed and that specifies, like any plan of action, which activities should be done when, by who, and with which tools. Suppose that as part of that production plan, toxic chemicals are regularly released into the nearby river. On my account, you need neither intend to participate in the releasing of these chemicals nor even know about it for you to count as complicit in the polluting of the nearby river. Third, it seems to me that this tentative account of complicity captures an illuminating feature of complicity found in all of its instances. In my view, what our judgments of complicity always track is not whether you, along with others, have causally contributed to wrongdoing. What they track is no more whether you intended to participate along with others in wrongdoing, although of course the presence or absence of participatory intentions surely guide our judgments about whether an instance of complicity was blameworthy. Instead, what judgments of complicity track on my account is whether there was a wrongful plan of action in which you did your part, intentionally or not, knowingly or not. Now, I've only offered a tentative account of minimal complicity, and there are many questions that I've left unanswered. So I'll stop here, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.